There's a peculiar moment that unfolds in almost every long conversation. It rarely begins with raised voices or obvious disagreement. Instead, it starts with a subtle realization that the two people involved are no longer discussing the same reality. One person keeps adjusting their understanding as new information appears. The other seems to defend an invisible boundary around what they already believe. From the outside, it can look like stubbornness. Yet psychology suggests something more complex is unfolding beneath the surface. Our culture has long treated intelligence as something that can be measured with exams, vocabulary, or professional achievement. Those measures capture certain abilities, but they overlook another side of cognition that quietly shapes every conversation we have. Everyday reasoning depends less on how much information a person possesses and more on what their mind does when that information no longer fits comfortably. The real test is not remembering facts. It is deciding what happens after those facts collide with an existing belief. The human brain is built to conserve energy. Despite representing only a small percentage of our body weight, it consumes an extraordinary share of our daily energy supply. To avoid overload, it relies on shortcuts. Most of those shortcuts are remarkably useful. They allow us to make thousands of decisions without consciously analyzing every possibility. Yet the same efficiency can become a trap. When a situation grows uncertain or emotionally demanding, the mind often reaches for the simplest explanation available, even if reality is far more complicated. This tendency reveals itself in language long before it appears in actions. Listen carefully to conversations where every issue is framed as absolute. Everything becomes either success or failure, loyalty or betrayal, truth or deception. Nuance quietly disappears. That isn't always a sign of malice or ignorance. Cognitive scientists describe this as a preference for cognitive closure, the desire to replace uncertainty with certainty as quickly as possible. Ambiguity requires mental effort. Certainty feels comfortable. The more uncomfortable someone feels with complexity, the stronger the temptation becomes to reduce an intricate world into neat categories. Ironically, some of the strongest thinkers often sound less certain than everyone else. That can seem backward. Society tends to associate confidence with competence, but the relationship is far weaker than we assume. Researchers have repeatedly observed that people sometimes struggle to evaluate the quality of their own reasoning. The same skills required to solve a problem are often needed to recognize mistakes in solving it. When those reflective abilities are limited, confidence may remain untouched because there is little awareness that anything is missing. Psychologists refer to this pattern as the Kruger Effect, though it is frequently misunderstood. It does not mean confident people are incapable. It simply illustrates that self-assessment itself is a cognitive skill, and like every skill, it varies from person to person. Think about how experts usually answer difficult questions. They often pause. They qualify their statements. They acknowledge exceptions. To someone seeking absolute certainty, this hesitation can appear weak. Yet those pauses are often evidence of a mind running multiple possibilities at once instead of racing toward the first satisfying answer. Reflection is quieter than certainty, which is why it is so easy to overlook. Another subtle pattern emerges when beliefs become emotionally expensive to question. Neuroscientists have found that challenging deeply held convictions can activate brain regions associated with threat detection rather than detached reasoning. In other words, the brain sometimes reacts to conflicting information less like a classroom discussion and more like a personal attack. Once that happens, the conversation is no longer about evidence. It becomes an attempt to protect identity. This helps explain why two people can witness the same event and leave with entirely different conclusions. They are not necessarily processing different facts. They are filtering those facts through different emotional priorities. One person asks, "Is this true?" The other unconsciously asks, "What does accepting this say about me?" Those questions lead the mind down very different paths. That difference matters because beliefs rarely exist in isolation. They become connected to friendships, political identities, careers, family traditions, and personal history. Removing a single belief can feel like pulling a thread from an entire tapestry. For some people, Changing their mind means revising one opinion. For others, it feels like risking the collapse of the story they tell themselves about who they are. The stronger that attachment becomes, the harder objective reasoning can become. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the psychological cost of accepting it feels unexpectedly high. Once reasoning becomes intertwined with identity, conversations begin to change in ways that are surprisingly predictable. The goal quietly shifts from discovering what is accurate to preserving what already feels safe. And that shift reveals itself through behaviors most people notice but rarely understand. The first clue is rarely found in what someone believes. It appears in how they respond when uncertainty enters the room. A reflective mind tends to slow down. It asks for context, weighs competing explanations, and occasionally changes direction. A more rigid thinking style often does the opposite. Questions become uncomfortable because questions delay certainty. Instead of exploring possibilities, the conversation begins orbiting a single conclusion, as though every new piece of information must be forced into an existing narrative. Psychologists sometimes describe this as motivated reasoning. It is not the deliberate rejection of evidence. It is the unconscious habit of evaluating information based on whether it protects a preferred belief rather than whether it explains reality more accurately. The remarkable part is that people usually experience this process as objective thinking. The conclusion feels logical because the emotional filtering happens before conscious awareness has a chance to notice it. This is one reason debates so often become exhausting instead of enlightening. From the outside, it looks like both people are discussing the same topic. Internally, they are solving different problems. One is trying to understand the issue. The other is trying to defend an identity. Facts alone rarely bridge that gap because the disagreement was never purely factual to begin with. The same mechanism influences the way some people handle disagreement itself. Notice what happens when someone cannot comfortably hold two competing ideas in mind. Rather than exploring the strongest version of another person's argument, they often reduce it into an exaggerated or simplified version that is easier to dismiss. Social psychologists call this a form of cognitive simplification. It reduces mental effort, but also narrows perspective. Reality becomes easier to navigate, yet significantly less accurate. Conversation also changes in another subtle way. Genuine curiosity begins to disappear. Instead of asking questions that might reveal something unexpected, every question is designed to confirm what is already believed. This reflects confirmation bias, one of the most thoroughly documented tendencies in cognitive science. The human brain naturally searches for information that reinforces familiar patterns because consistency feels psychologically rewarding. Contradictory evidence demands extra mental work, and mental work is something the brain instinctively tries to minimize whenever possible. There is another behavior that often gets mistaken for strength. Some individuals dominate conversations through repetition rather than reasoning. They restate the same point with greater intensity, believing that persistence itself increases credibility. Yet repetition has a curious psychological effect. Hearing the same statement repeatedly can make it feel more familiar, and familiarity is often confused with truth. Researchers refer to this as the illusory truth effect. It influences everyone to some degree, which is why repetition can feel persuasive even when no new evidence has been introduced. This explains why certain arguments seem impossible to move forward. They are not evolving, they are looping. Each repetition feels like progress to the speaker because conviction is growing, while the actual exchange of ideas quietly stops. What looks like confidence may simply be a conversation trapped inside the same mental circuit. Patterns like these also shape how people think about consequences. Some minds naturally project themselves into the future, mentally testing different outcomes before acting. Others remain anchored to whatever feels urgent in the present moment. Neither style is absolute. Everyone shifts depending on stress, emotion, and experience. But when reflective thinking weakens, immediate rewards often overshadow distant consequences. Neuroscientists associate much of this future-oriented thinking with networks involving the prefrontal cortex, an area deeply involved in planning, impulse regulation, and weighing alternatives. When those processes are interrupted by emotional pressure, fatigue, or cognitive overload, short-term reactions begin to dominate long-term reasoning. Decisions become increasingly driven by what reduces discomfort right now, rather than what produces better outcomes later. That is why hindsight often feels so obvious. Once the emotional pressure disappears, the chain of cause and effect suddenly becomes visible. During the moment itself, the brain was occupied with solving an immediate emotional problem, not constructing a careful prediction of the future. One final shift often goes unnoticed because it hides behind defensiveness. Feedback is one of the few experiences that simultaneously tests knowledge, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. Accepting correction requires separating personal worth from personal performance. That separation sounds simple, but psychologically, it is remarkably demanding. If criticism feels like a threat to identity, the brain's protective systems activate before reflective thinking has time to respond. The result is familiar. Explanations become excuses. Responsibility is redirected. The conversation quietly transforms from, "What can I learn?" into, "How do I protect myself?" from the outside. This may resemble arrogance or hostility. Beneath the surface, it often reflects something more fragile. A self-concept that cannot easily absorb the possibility of being wrong without feeling diminished. The surprising part is that these patterns are not reserved for a particular group of people. They exist in smaller ways inside every human mind. Under stress, fatigue, social pressure, or fear, almost anyone becomes more certain than the evidence deserves, more defensive than the situation requires, or more willing to protect a familiar belief and examine an uncomfortable one. The difference is rarely whether these tendencies appear. It is how quickly they are recognized and corrected. This is where metacognition becomes one of the most valuable cognitive abilities a person can develop. It is often described as thinking about thinking, but that phrase barely captures its importance. Metacognition is the quiet capacity to step outside your own reasoning and ask an unsettling question. What if the problem isn't the information I'm receiving, but the way I'm interpreting it? That moment of self-examination interrupts the brain's autopilot. Instead of defending every conclusion, the mind begins inspecting the process that created the conclusion in the first place. Curiously, history is filled with examples of brilliant individuals abandoning ideas they once defended with complete conviction. Scientists, philosophers, and innovators have often changed their views after encountering stronger evidence. Their reputations did not grow because they were incapable of being wrong. They grew because they treated revision as a strength rather than a humiliation. Progress in science has never depended on certainty. It has depended on the willingness to replace explanations that no longer fit reality. The opposite pattern is easy to miss because it often disguises itself as consistency. There is comfort in never changing your mind. Familiar beliefs provide stability, especially during uncertain times. Yet stability and accuracy are not the same thing. A map that never changes may feel reassuring, but if the landscape has shifted, confidence in the map only increases the chance of getting lost. Social environments make this even more complicated. Human beings evolved in groups where belonging often mattered more than being correct. Losing acceptance from a tribe could once threaten survival itself. That ancient wiring still influences modern behavior. We instinctively notice signals that tell us whether our opinions strengthen or weaken our connection to the people around us. Sometimes agreement is less about evidence than about maintaining relationships, status, or identity. The brain is solving a social problem while convincing itself is solving an intellectual one. This realization changes the way difficult conversations are understood. The loudest disagreement is not always driven by the largest difference in facts. It is often driven by the largest difference in psychological needs. One person may be searching for clarity, while another is searching for certainty. One is willing to update a mental model. The other is trying to protect one. Those motivations create conversations that appear logical on the surface, but are powered by entirely different emotional engines underneath. Recognizing these patterns is not an invitation to categorize people or quietly rank their intelligence. That instinct carries its own cognitive trap. The moment we assume these biases belong only to someone else, we become vulnerable to them ourselves. The mind is remarkably skilled at spotting irrationality across the table while remaining blind to its own blind spots. Intellectual humility begins with the uncomfortable possibility that the same mechanisms we observe in others may also be shaping our own judgments in ways we have not yet noticed. Perhaps the clear sign of mature reasoning is not the speed with which someone reaches an answer, but the ease with which they can reconsider one. A flexible mind does not abandon principles every time it encounters disagreement. It simply leaves room for reality to be more complicated than its first impression. That quiet openness rarely attracts attention because it lacks the drama of certainty. Yet it is often the quality that allows understanding to deepen over a lifetime. The next time you find yourself in a conversation that seems impossible, resist the temptation to ask a single, familiar question. Why won't this person understand? A more revealing question is this: what invisible need is guiding the way each of us is thinking right now? That shift changes everything. It moves the focus away from winning an argument and toward understanding the architecture of the human mind. In the end, the most consequential divide between people is rarely how much they know. It is how they respond when reality asks them to make room for something they did not expect. Knowledge can be accumulated in libraries, classrooms, and search engines. The willingness to reshape one's own thinking is far rarer. And perhaps that is the quiet hallmark of an agile mind. Not the confidence to defend every belief, but the courage to let a better idea replace it when the evidence finally arrives.